Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. Before we start today's show, I wanted to thank everyone who's listening. You may have heard some different formats recently. The last episode featured New England writer Kathleen Langone on the artist Emilia, and a few months back, Clive Webb read on a Scottish fraudster who swindled Jay Gould. I love all the shows I do, but these are especially fun because they're collaborative. And if any listeners are out there that have an idea for a show, send me an email and let's talk. It's probably a good idea. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed today's look at U.S.-Latin American relations in the Gilded Age. A few years back, I reviewed a wonderful book by Jay Nahr on the transnational history of Uruguay and the United States in the 1920s. Nahr showed that the ideas of American progressivism did not materialize only at home or in a vacuum. In fact, the Colorado Party in Uruguay was conceiving of progressivism at the same time as Bull Moose Republicans, populists, or Robert La Follette. More importantly, their ideas commingled in the Western Hemisphere like a petri dish of political experimentation. Today, we're joined by Dr. Roberto Saba, who uses the same setting to explain how North and South America debated industrial capitalism in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, 3 decades that saw the transformation of the United States and Brazil from slave economies to wage economies. Now, that transition, as we'll hear soon enough, was not identical in the United States and in Brazil. The story brings us all over these places, to Boston's financial district, the coffee plantations of São Paulo, and the cotton plantations of southern Brazil. In all of these places, the front line of the future economy is being bred, and the way that they developed without slavery offers us an insight into the development of hemispheric relations. Now, that brief introduction that I've just given does an injustice to Roberto's study because it does so little to tell you about what his book covers. It's extraordinary, it's lengthy, and it's well detailed. He's researched the private papers of individual activists, business leaders, agricultural and industrial journals, and government documents to present a really vivid account of the economy of the American South. And by American South, I mean North American and South American as a southern region and area. Now, I'm also purposely not going to introduce Professor Saba's interests because my first question will be about how he refers to his own multifaceted research. What I will say is that Professor Saba is a professor of American Studies at Wesleyan University and has studied in Brazil before earning his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome to the show, Roberto.
Thanks, Mike. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm delighted to have you. Normally, I start off by introducing people that come on by saying, oh, these are all the great things that they've done, and these are their research interests. And I am struggling a little bit with you because you're multi-talented, really, in terms of the work that you do is, in the best way that I can say, interdisciplinary. And so, in a way, I was hoping that you might introduce a little bit about the work that you do because it covers politics, economics, globalization, imperialism. How do you wrestle with all these fields, and how would you describe, in your own words, your scholarship?
Well, I've been always fascinated since I was a student at the University of São Paulo by comparative history. And the comparative scholarship that, emerged here in the US and also in Latin America in the 60s, 70s was interdisciplinary by nature. So that was a model for me. And what I try to do with my work now is to take the next step, right? To do it transnationally, to try to not only compare, but connect. And when you're trying to connect to different countries with such, complex histories and so many transformations, especially in the long 19th century, you need to use tools from different disciplines. You need to take approaches that are, from classic works and from new stuff. So that's what I've been trying to do. And now working at an American Studies department here at Wesleyan, it has, also made me look back and see that this is the way to go. I think this is, with this new transnational wave of scholarship, we see amazing work being done by the likes of Sven Beckert, Ichiro Azuma, who also draw on different disciplines, different approaches, different methods.
Well, you work across disciplines, but there is a sort of basis in two camps, and that's a personal one as well as a professional one. So you write about Brazil and the United States, and you've got that personal connection living in the US, but being brought up in Brazil, right?
Yes, yeah. And, like many Brazilians and many Americans, I'm from a family of immigrants from all over the world. So, and I have cousins and siblings who have moved away from Brazil and, circulate. So that's another personal connection that made me interested in these exchanges, right? My personal life. And also, having been born and raised in Brazil, I went to college there and then came here for my PhD in 2011 and have been here since. These are personal connections that I have, but I'm also fascinated by this period when circulation wasn't that, easy, when they were actually making this globalized world that now we take for granted. When travelers like the missionaries, the educators, the students that I write about had to take steamships and spend weeks at sea, and then they couldn't call, they couldn't email, they couldn't Zoom with their family. So I'm also fascinated about what they were creating and how they were improvising, how they were building this, as I say in the book, brave new world of globalization and capitalism.
Well, let's flash back there then. Okay. So let's start. The book is called American Mirror. It's an outstanding book, not just because of the various talents that you bring to bear on it, but naturally for listeners, they're going to be interested in these three decades. It's the 1860s, the 1870s, and the 1880s. They're critically important when we think about slavery and economics. So as a start, why don't you just summarize your findings in the book?
Sure. So actually, I begin in the mid 1840s and on chapter 1, looking into how pro-slavery Southerners failed to bring what seemed to be the natural ally for the pro-slavery cause to their camp, which was Brazil. The United States by the 1840s, 1850s had 4 million slaves. Brazil had 2 million, with half the free population of the United States. So they were similar demographically. And Brazilians had no interest in what the South had to offer. And I tried to show that because there was no expertise, there was no technology, there was no, diplomatic influence that Brazilians could see was profitable for them in the American South. On the other hand, they saw that the North had a lot to offer them and could help them in the transition from slavery to wage labor, which was something that Brazilian elites, the planters, like many elites around the world, had been trying to do for a long time, especially because they were under British imperialist pressure. So that was kind of a surprise for me during the research. I thought the book would be a lot about Brazil and its relation with the American South, but the Northerners appeared as this new influence, this new power, helping Brazilians shape their path to free labor. So what I saw was this movement of Brazilians interested in what was going on in the United States, and Republicans, Yankees, capitalists from the North, interested in exchanging with Brazil and investing in Brazil and helping Brazil make the transition that the South refused to make. So that's basically what happened during the research, and my main find was that Brazil gave the Republicans the opportunity to do what they had planned to do in the South, but were unable because of reactionary forces.
It's a great story, and I'm not that surprised that Boston appears as the epicenter of the story in that, antebellum and also Civil War period. I mean, it's the hub of capital. It's also the puritanical heart of American morality. But your story really focuses on capitalism as the driving force, and you just really eloquently, enunciated that here. But I was wondering about morality, and particularly that Christian morality of the abolitionists. What part does that play in Brazil?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think these things cannot be separated, right? Because this missionary mentality of missionaries, but also educators, scientists, capitalists, bankers, investors, who are trying to help Brazil transition to free labor, is both a religious and an economic mentality. They see that, the triumph of their enterprises, the success in building railroads, in established businesses, in opening schools, in exchange commodities and technology with Brazil, mean that they are, the chosen people of God in a way. They have this civilizing mission that, later we know what is going to happen and how that's going to turn into imperialism and expansion abroad. I'm thinking about like Rudyard Kipling and the White Man's Burden and, the War of 1898. But I want to avoid that teleological narrative. I want to show that there were alternative ways that this so-called civilizing mission could be, exerted in another country. And perhaps this alternative influence, this capitalist missionary influence that Northerners had in Brazil helped shape American power in the early 20th century when it finally became one of the greatest empires.
Okay, so I know the answer to this because I read the book, but given the explanation about the role that Northerners played in Brazil, and you've also said that Brazilians were open to the idea of emancipation as early as the 1840s, perhaps, why does it take another 40 years for Brazil to emancipate their slaves?
Well, yeah, that's the central question, and I get that a lot, because they were interested in preserving, perhaps expanding the power of the planter class. And it took, trial and error, testing new forms of management, concentrating capital, investing, expanding the workforce through immigration, and controlling the very process. So they were in no rush in accomplish emancipation in Brazil. And by they, I mean these Northerners. They were glad to, see the Brazilian planter class take their time and do it as they thought properly by, buying machinery, by adopting scientific methods of agriculture, by coming to the United States to study at land-grant universities and seeing how agro-industry should work. And on the other hand, many Northerners, as we know from the history, the tragic history of Reconstruction and the post-Reconstruction period, had been regretting what had happened in the American South, right? There's a pushback against radical republicanism and the liberal Republicans take over. And it's these people who actually influence Brazil and are glad to work with the Brazilian planters to make sure that emancipation is going to help capital, not labor.
I mean, what's the legacy of that in Brazil, the gradual, because you, like you say about the radical Republicans, you don't have the same rifts in Brazil, I'm guessing, that you do in the United States today.
Well, there were radical abolitionists in Brazil, and some of them radicalized after emancipation as they saw what wage labor was becoming, right? What they thought would be freedom was very different from what they had dreamed with. But they were silenced because the powers of the planter class were preserved and expanded. On the one hand, gradual emancipation created, especially in São Paulo, in Southeast Brazil, one of the most developed, if not the most developed region in terms of industrialization, infrastructure, trade of the global South. And they didn't, from an elite perspective, it was a awesome deal because they didn't have to deal with all the chaos, the revolutionary forces that took over the American South during Reconstruction. On the other hand, in terms of race relations, from that moment to this day, it's complicated in Brazil because these questions were silenced right? Brazil has a very different form of racism, but it is a very racist country because there is no open public debate. Of course, there had always been social forces, activist groups, especially formed of Afro-Brazilians and the working class that try to bring these questions to the table, but the elites preserved their power to such an extent that they were able to muffle, to silence these debates. And we built this culture that is based on, the mid-20th century Gilberto Freire's idea of a racial democracy, which is in itself a form of brutal racism.
It's an incredible story that I think what your book does is it gets to the wellspring of that. And what you do to get to the wellspring is to show off some really interesting historical characters. I mean, you introduce and articulate the position of pro-slavery Americans, anti-slavery Americans, Brazilian elites, and others. Who do you think are the most important characters in this story, and why is that?
That's a great question. I'm really fascinated by these brokers, people like James Cooley Fletcher, who was a Presbyterian missionary from Indianapolis, whose father was a banker and member of the Republican Party. And he lived in Switzerland for a while. And he goes to Brazil to work for the Seamen's Missionary Society. And he just, becomes very close to the Brazilian elite, including the Emperor Dom Pedro II. And he then starts connecting American engineers, entrepreneurs, bankers with Brazilian politicians and Brazilian planters. And he's able to circulate and help create, for example, the United States and Brazilian steamship line in the 1860s. That's the first direct line of steamers connecting New York to Rio. And there are others who learn with him, Brazilian and American brokers that bring these two countries together. And as I was saying before, the fact that they were doing this at the time before the telephone, before Zoom, right, is mind-blowing. It's really fascinating. And they play a major role. It is a book about elites. It is a book about, a small group of people who get together to, devise a plan for the future of agriculture and trade. But they had huge influence. Their decisions, their networks, their ideas, their projects transformed not only Brazil and the United States, but the relations between these two countries.
It seems as though Brazil also has this, I wouldn't say love-hate, but fear of direct investment, foreign direct investment, but also maybe a courtship of that foreign investment as well. So how does that play out? Because it seems like that is a prevalent theme in everything that these actors are doing.
Yeah, and that's true of today as well, right? But this is a very special moment, I think, because Brazilians, first, the United States wasn't as powerful as some other powers in the world then. The British, the French, even the Spanish, if you think in terms of networks and power abroad, especially in relation to Latin America. So Brazilians were able to, perhaps this is not the right word, but to manage American investment much better because these Yankees didn't have the upper hand, right? They were still learning how to go abroad and exert their power. And at the same time, Brazil could play with these different powers with, the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Americans, and use one against the other, and, bargain and bring different actors. And that, and they did it materially, for example, when building the Dom Pedro II Railroad, which connects Rio to the coffee producing region of the interior. And parts of it parts were built by British companies, other parts by American companies. Sometimes there were British companies working with American technology, American engineers working for British contractors, and there were Brazilians involved as well. And that's what I mean by negotiating, by working with different powers and being able to exert Brazilian influence.
We know where the story goes because we know the United States agency in Brazil is only growing, through that direct foreign investment. But Britain is such a huge player at this time too. And I mean, maybe we can talk a little bit about that. I mean, there's a longer history of European financing in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina. I don't know, maybe I've just answered my question here, but why did Brazil grow closer to the United States and not closer to Britain?
Well, the British were an empire, and they had been pressuring Brazil for decades, especially when it came to slavery. And so Brazilians, in the 1850s, 1860s, found these anti-slavery Northerners who are anti-British and who are willing to work with Brazil in a non-imperialist way to help Brazilians make the transition. The British never went away. The British were useful for Brazil and for Brazilian elites and other Latin American elites at the time. But the United States was this alternative to this kind of interventionist anti-slavery empire that the British became, especially after the American Revolution in the 1830s. So Brazilians see, someone, a power they can work with, and that's what the North represent. And a power that has, all these new technologies to offer, all this new expertise, and that has been going through a process that is not the same, but is parallel to what, would happen in Brazil, that is slave emancipation.
I guess the reason why I'm thinking about Britain and the United States too is that there is, in the scholarship, a book like Mark Palin's book about the conspiracy of free trade. There is this debate going on about what American trade policy is going to look like. And is it going to be more like British free trade and that Cobden idea, or is it going to be more like the Listian Republican protectionism? And, because that debate's going on and primarily in the North, with these same traders that are, moving down south and investing in Brazil, I'm just wondering, do those debates play out in Brazil the same way they're playing out all over the world at this time?
They did. And what I see is that they did both. And both sides were happy with that, because these countries, unlike, the US and the UK, which had similar economies, they were both industrializing and were competing, right, against one another for markets and also, for trade and exchange among themselves. Brazil was an agrarian society that produced a commodity that, we still cannot produce in North America. Coffee here in the continental United States. And the industrial North was this region of the world going through the second industrial revolution, right? Producing technology that Brazilians really craved, really wanted to have, but weren't producing themselves. So that's why Brazilians are fine with American protectionism, with American incentives to their own industry, because that doesn't affect Brazilian interests, especially exporting coffee. On the contrary, because coffee is this powerful stimulant. I was just having some right now. It can serve American industrialization really well, right? Because workers, proletarians, working on assembly lines in American factories for 10 hours a day, they're gonna be drinking a lot of Brazilian coffee. So
brilliant stuff. I mean, okay, so there's coffee, and that is definitely unique to Brazil. And the timeliness is, tea is kind of falling out of fashion at this time frame too. So coffee's going to be the real, as important as it is now. But cotton isn't something that Brazil has a lock on. That's something that's going to be competitive, and free trade is going to, well, it would open up I suppose, the United States to an influx of cotton from places like India or Brazil. So how does Brazil navigate that? I mean, I know we're talking probably post-Civil War when the cotton industry collapses in the South, but how does Britain-American relations over cotton play out during these years?
The cotton produced in Brazil that begins during the Civil War and after, with many incentives from the Manchester Cotton Supply Association, for example, and British capitalists who want, new suppliers to avoid the reliance that they had on the American South. That cotton gets exported initially, but later in the 1870s, it becomes a way to begin a process of industrialization, especially in places like the province of São Paulo. And it's small scale. It's part of this project to diversify the Brazilian economy that the very coffee planters have. And that doesn't really affect or threaten in any way capitalists from the United States or from Great Britain. What actually happens is that Brazil, these manufacturers, these small-scale cotton textile manufacturers in Brazil, they're going to be importing machinery from the United States and also from Great Britain in order to industrialize. So actually, that's the main thing that's helped both sides. It's not as much about textiles, but it's about capital goods. It's about machinery. It's about the second industrial revolution, this new world of steel that is emerging in that era. And that's the main entryway of American capital in Brazil.
Fascinating. And it makes me think as well about, because there's all these interconnections, and excluding Britain, but obviously I want to include the United States and the Southerners that would go down and plant cotton in Brazil. How does that change the conception of Pan-Americanism at this time? Because that debate is really going to kick off in earnest again in the 1880s with James Blaine and his move for greater Pan-American cooperation. And it sort of dissipated in the years between the 1820s and the 1880s, or it was on a decline. So I'm wondering where that story of Pan-Americanism fits in with the Brazil-America story in these years.
Yeah, that's something that's right after the period I finished the book at. But the seeds are already there in the cooperation I'm talking about, and I think the main force kind of shaping what's going to become Pan-Americanism is this anti-European sentiment that both countries share, and that becomes really relevant during the Civil War, when the French intervene in Mexico. Spain intervenes in the Dominican Republic and in Peru. You have the British trying to manipulate all sides, including the Confederacy, right? Try to split the United States. And it's a moment in which both Brazilian and Northern American elites and other Latin American elites realize that they need to watch out for each other, and that the main players, the main empires, if you look at Africa or Asia, are the Europeans. So the United States, in a way, is a benign force from a Latin American perspective at this time. Again, we cannot read history backwards, right? We know what's going to happen in the 20th century. Already in the late 19th century. But at the time, it made sense. It made sense to invite the Yankees in. It made sense for Latin American elites to believe Lincoln when he says that the Union is the last best hope of mankind.
I mean, can I just say that's one of the reasons why I think your book should be on reading lists, is because there's a number of historiographical questions that you show us answers to or glimpses of, and this Pan-Americanism question is one of them. One of the reasons why it erupts in the 1880s is because of 3 or 4 decades worth of networking and cooperation towards a partnership that's going to build roads across the 2 continents and railways and all of that. The other question, historiographical question, that I think your book grapples with really well is one about geography, because we've been tinkering with the idea of what is the American South for a long time now, and I think what your book does, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it draws the southern United States into Brazil's orbit, and almost redraws the borders of the South American continent in some regards.
Yeah, there was this idea, and that's why they got so self-confident, right? And perhaps failed to bring Brazil into their orbit, that the American South would be able to continue doing what they had done to Mexican Texas, right? That they, you see the filibusters in Nicaragua, the plans they have for Cuba. And what I try to do is to flip a little bit the story and show that, there were powers in South America, in Latin America, who were aware of what the South, the imperialist pro-slavery Southerners, were doing. And like they were doing with the North and the British, they also did with the North and the South, trying to manipulate these forces. Right after the war, they invite Southerners to come to Brazil to produce cotton. Southerners go with this idea that they can revive the slave South in Brazil and they can become major planters again and teach Brazilians how to be slaveholders. And actually, they become sharecroppers. They become totally dependent on the Brazilian elite. So what I try to show is that, Latin Americans and Brazilians, in this case, were well informed about what was going on and how they could use these clashing forces here in North America to their own advantage.
That's a great segue to the metaphor that you actually use in the book, which is this idea of a mirror. You've written that it allows us to think about the United States and Brazil as being in a state of constant response. Tell us about what the constant response is.
Yeah, so in a way, they had a creative approach to each other, and that's what I want to do when I use the mirror metaphor. They look at each other as someone looks in the mirror, and imagine what they can do with themselves. Americans, Northerners, looked at Brazil and saw that, perhaps they could do in Brazil and with the Brazilians what they were unable to do with the American South. And that in Brazil, they could prove themselves to the world, including the British, including European empires, that the United States was in the game, that the US could exert power abroad and could help bring a new style of modernization, of capitalist development to other countries. Brazilians, for their part, looked at the United States and saw things that they wanted to do, that they wanted to accomplish, that they wanted, to use as a model. And the westward expansion is part of it. Agro-industry, as it's emerging in the Midwest and in the West, in places like California, is something that Brazilians are fascinated about. And also things that they didn't like, that they didn't want to do. And that was the South, right? The plantation economy of the South before the war, the reactionary stances of Southerners after the war, the very form of racial terror that existed in the American South was something that Brazilian elites wanted to avoid. So, that's the mirror metaphor that I'm trying to work with.
I love it. I think it's a great metaphor. It works really well. There were parts where I did wonder, like you mentioned the West there, for example. I mean, I get the rejection of the South, and I get, the storytelling about Southerners coming to Brazil expecting to have, Dixie and, in Brazil is incredible. But what about indigenous peoples? I couldn't help but think about the parallels in the American West and in Brazil. How do they fare in this period in Brazil? Because I think a lot of people know how indigenous people in the United States fare, and it's not well. How's the story in Brazil, and is it a mirror?
Yeah, well, that's a book to be written. That's something that, I felt throughout the research and the writing process that, would be something very interesting to address, but would open so many, new questions. It would be, it deserves its own monograph. It deserves its own research. And I know there are historians thinking about this. This is something that I want to do in the future as well, to think about the global West, right? But I think there's a parallel to the question of Black-white relations, right? In Brazil, these, indigenous people were suffering from displacement, genocide, all sorts of brutalization, but these questions were silenced. The Brazilian elites, through, their cultural hegemony, were able to leave it aside, to not discuss it, to not make it such a big political question as it had happened in the United States. And it seems to me that it's part of what they're learning from the United States. They see the Indian Wars that start actually during the Civil War, right, and extend well into the 1890s, and they manage this question differently in Brazil from what they learned from the United States. But again, this is something that needs to be taken seriously by a historian in the future. Hopefully we'll see something.
Okay, watch this space. So I guess, right? It's fascinating. I mean, that was something that stood out to me. The other thing that stood out to me was, you've already mentioned the Brave New World chapter, which explores the lives of journalists and engineers, freedmen, how they're all interconnected. What do you think makes these people so compelling for this time period as well? I mean, it seems like they are, I know you were saying that you can't look at history from, the future back, but what makes these people such change makers?
Well, they're imagining a new future. They are creating something completely new, because if we think about labor, right, historically, the idea of free labor was rare, before the 19th century. The idea that people will sell their labor power and get a wage in exchange is something that only exists in a few pockets of the North Atlantic. And these guys are actually saying, no, this should be a universal mode of production. This should be applied everywhere. And this is a major change, because unfree labor or family labor or, local forms of self-sufficiency, self-reliance were dominant until then. And they want to bring this new wage labor reality to the whole world. And now it seems, this is the natural development out of unfree labor, the fact that wage labor should prevail, but that wasn't so clear. And if you look, like Thomas Holt did and other historians did, from the perspective of enslaved people, of peasants, of agrarian peoples everywhere in the world, wage labor was not what they had planned. It was not what they wanted. They wanted, like the freed people in the United States, something like 40 acres and a mule, autonomy, working on their own, building and protecting their own communities. And these modernizers, these anti-slavery reformers that I write about, they're going against the world of the slaveholders, but also of global peasantries that are thinking of alternative ways to build freedom.
Two other groups are in the feature heavily in the book are also going against those trends, or those sort of the previous generations and the way they saw the world, and that's educators and missionaries. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that, because your book, has a chapter that deals with these two groups as well.
Yeah, they were, they're part of, they were part of this modernizing anti-slavery transnational group that I write about. And they see education as a means to prepare elites in order to manage wage labor, to adopt new technologies, to keep improving, to keep applying science to production, right? And your first question, or one of your first questions about, the religious and the economic aspects of this exchange, it's here, right? The same way that they think that, good Christians will create good enterprises, they also think that good educators, good schools will help local elites modernize and become more cosmopolitan and be part of this global capitalist system. And that's what they're doing in places like the province of São Paulo, beginning in the 1870s.
So I think everyone can understand where this book is going. Economics touches every aspect of life in America and Brazil. And I really just have to thank Roberto so much for coming on. The book it's an outstanding take on bilateral relations in a global context, but told through a really wonderfully interdisciplinary lens. So I can't thank you enough for your time and for the book.
Thank you. This has been a huge pleasure. We always learn something new when we engage in these conversations about our own work. So thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.